Hey, welcome back everybody. Mr. Randolph here. In this video, I want to talk about eukaryotic cell structures that are important for making proteins. So before we get into that though, let's talk about why this is one of the more important jobs that cells are going to go through. Proteins are, if you think back to our biochemistry unit, these molecules that carry out certain jobs for cells. And when we get into protein synthesis and how proteins are made, you'll see a little bit more about how that's possible. But proteins really are these multi-tools. They do all of these different things for cells. So they're really, really important. Let's think about, let's say, specialized cells in humans. A skin cell versus a muscle cell. Those cells are able to do their jobs because they make certain proteins that are specific for that cell. A skin cell has certain proteins on the cell membrane here that allow certain things in and out, the proteins that make up the cytoskeleton that give it its particular shape so that it can do its job. All of those are specific to a skin cell, whereas a muscle cell has other proteins that allow it to contract and relax so that our muscles can help us move. And those proteins are really specific to that certain cell type. So this is a really, really, really important job that cells carry out, is making proteins. Let's go ahead, before we get started, and define this term organelles. We do this with all the cell structure videos, but we'll do it again. Organelle kind of translates to little organ, and those are those internal membrane-bound structures within a cell. And so when we look, we can see that these things are all separated from everything else by the membrane that's around them. So we're going to talk about some specific organelles in eukaryotic cells today. We'll start with the nucleus. And so let's talk about the nucleus and its job in helping to make proteins within the cell. Now, you've been taught up to this point that the nucleus is the brain of the cell or the control center of the cell, and so it gets called all of these different things, but how does it do that? I mean, really, what is the nucleus doing that makes it control everything? Really, in all honesty, all the nucleus does is store the DNA. That's where all of that genetic material for the cell is kept. And so it controls things by keeping the DNA inside of it. Well, let's think back to our biochemistry unit again. And what does DNA really do? Well, DNA, as a nucleic acid, is just a set of instructions to make proteins. That's all it is. And so all of the instructions that cell needs to make every protein that it's supposed to make is stored within that DNA inside the nucleus. And that's why the nucleus is called the control center, because it has the instruction manual. It's got that master copy of all that stuff that the cell's going to need at some point. And so that's really why we call it the brain. It stores all of the information that the cell's going to use to make proteins. So let's take a little look at a nucleus here. Here's a little sketch that a student did several years ago of a nucleus. And so it's this kind of ball-like structure, and when we look at cells in the microscope, a lot of times you'll see it as that circle or that spot within the cell that you can see if it's been stained correctly. Well, inside, and you can see this drawing looks like the top of it has been cut off here, there's some things. Well, the DNA is floating around inside there, and that's where all of your genetic material, all those instructions for making proteins is stored. And then within the nucleus, there's this really dense region called the nucleolus. And that nucleolus is an area where the ribosomes get produced. And so we'll talk about what ribosomes do here in a little bit, but ultimately this right here is where everything that we need to make proteins is stored or made. All of that stuff gets out through these little nuclear pores that are on the membrane. Remember, this is an organelle, so it's got a membrane around it, which makes perfect sense. And it's got these little pores, these holes in it that allow those instructions to come out and the ribosome parts to come out of the nucleus and go where they need to go. So, now that everything's left the nucleus and we're ready to make our protein, let's talk about how that happens, or really where that happens. We'll go into more detail about the actual production and making of proteins in another video down the line about protein synthesis, but here I just want to talk about the parts within the cell that all work together to make that happen. So let's start with ribosomes. Ribosomes are these little things within the cell that are made up of ribonucleic acid, or RNA, and other proteins. And their job really is to assemble the proteins, to put those together. They read the instructions that come from the nucleus, and they put the amino acids together in that specific order that makes that protein. Ribosomes, if you recall, are also found in prokaryotic cells. They're very, very small. They're not surrounded by their own membrane, so we wouldn't call them a membrane-bound nucleus, or membrane-bound organelle, but they do have a very specific function, and their job is to read the instructions and put all the pieces together to make the proteins. And so we find ribosomes all throughout the cell. However, you'll find a lot of them really right there around the nucleus. And it makes perfect sense. If the instructions for making the proteins are in the nucleus, we want to keep our little workers, our workbench that makes the proteins, kind of by where the instructions are kept. And so we see a big concentration of ribosomes right there by the nucleus. And that's their job. The ribosomes make proteins. You'll find a lot of ribosomes on another organelle called endoplasmic reticulum. So the endoplasmic reticulum is this folded area or folded membrane that's just all wrapped around really the nucleus. And so let's look over here at this picture. This right here is endoplasmic reticulum. Here's our nucleus where all the DNA is kept. Here's our endoplasmic reticulum, and each one of those little blue dots on there is a ribosome. Those ribosomes that are on that endoplasmic reticulum are putting together the proteins. And then the endoplasmic reticulum is a spot where the protein actually gets folded into its shape. And so some of that, the finishing parts of making the protein work and putting it all together, happen there on the endoplasmic reticulum. And so why is the endoplasmic reticulum folded up? Well, if we look at how long this is, it's kind of like our human intestines. It's very, very long. It wouldn't fit inside the cell if it wasn't folded up, just like our intestines wouldn't fit into our abdomen if it wasn't folded up the way that it is. And so folding up on itself like this allows it to have a larger surface area where it can store more ribosomes and produce more proteins. Let's talk about the two types of endoplasmic reticulum. And so sometimes you'll see it referred to as rough ER and smooth ER, or rough endoplasmic reticulum and smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The rough one is where the ribosomes are stored, and we call it rough ER because, quite honestly, it looks like it would be rough if you were to touch it. It's because it's got ribosomes all over it. And so the rough ER is really important in that protein production and making the proteins. The smooth ER, and let's talk about it briefly here, it's not really involved in making proteins. The smooth ER over here that doesn't have any ribosomes on it is just a folded membrane that actually helps process lipids. And so this serves a different role over here in the digestion and the production of different lipids within the cell. But since we're talking about endoplasmic reticulum, we'll throw that in there here. As far as the protein production is concerned, though, it's our rough ER where that happens. Okay, another organelle that's important for making proteins is a vesicle. And a vesicle is an interesting little thing here. It's basically a membrane sac, and so the instructions leave the nucleus and they are carried over here to the ribosomes where the protein gets made. It gets folded and put together in a specific way in the endoplasmic reticulum. And then part of that endoplasmic reticulum kind of forms a bubble around the protein and pinches off. And we'll see that carry the protein wherever it needs to go. Sometimes they go out here to the cell membrane and they carry out a specific job there. Or they'll float over here to the Golgi apparatus where they get changed a little bit more. Or maybe the protein's carried over here somewhere within the cytoplasm to do a specific job. But a vesicle is really just kind of this little messenger. It's a package that's used to carry things throughout the cell. It can carry a lot of different things, and in this case, since we're talking about making proteins, they carry proteins. So that's the job of the vesicle. The Golgi apparatus is another organelle here, and so we can see that. Again, it's by the rough endoplasmic reticulum here. And the reason it's so close is because in some cases the proteins get shipped over to the Golgi apparatus through a vesicle, where they get changed in shape a little bit more so that they can do a very specific job. And so some of that, again, that finishing part of making the protein can happen here in the Golgi apparatus, sometimes called the Golgi body. Again, when that's finished, the protein gets put into a vesicle and shipped off where it needs to go. And so the Golgi apparatus is one of those last ones that we talk about when it comes to making proteins. So in short, we have all of our instructions stored here in the control center, in the DNA inside that nucleus to make the proteins. Those instructions get taken away and carried over to ribosomes right here by the nucleus, usually or in a lot of cases stored on the endoplasmic reticulum. The ribosomes are where proteins are put together, the parts of them are. They get folded and put in a specific shape in the endoplasmic reticulum. In some cases, it gets shipped through a vesicle over to the Golgi body where it's even finished off some more, and that protein gets put in the correct shape. And then from the Golgi body, those vesicles carry the protein where it needs to go. So those are the important organelles that the cell uses to make proteins. We'll go into that step-by-step process of protein synthesis in a lot more detail later on in the school year, and I go over that in some other videos. So if you're interested, please go check those out. But for right now, this is what I need you to know about this. And I'll go over some of the other organelles in some later videos. We'll talk about energy production and some of the other cell parts that carry out specific jobs.